Hey everybody, I wanted to put together a screencast to show you the new unit testing feature in repl.it and how we're going to use it for the DNA lab. So when you are in the lab, one of the first things you should do if you haven't done it already for the lab is to set up the unit tests. So over on the left-hand side panel, there is a unit tests button that got added recently, a little check mark at the bottom here. And if you click on that, you'll be in the unit testing feature. So for this lab, there are 3 unit tests you have to add. But before you can even do any of that, you need to make sure you go to Setup and you add an import statement to get your code into the unit testing area of repl.it. So you're going to say from, and then whatever you called the lab, and I think by default it's called DNA lab, and then you're going to import asterisk to import all of the functions from within that file. Save it, and then you're going to add a test. Now remember, with unit testing, the idea is we're going to test one function all on its own by itself and to make sure it works before we integrate it with any other code, any of the other functions that we're going to write. So if we want to, for example, test the DNA complement function, maybe we call the name of our test DNA complement. The testing feature will automatically create a function test DNA complement for us. Right. What I suggest you do, just to see an example of how it works, is click the Show Me an Example, where it gives you a little taste of what we're trying to do here, in a really easy context where we're just adding up numbers. And all it says is self.assert equals add 1 and 2 to get 3. All right, so remember, we're testing to see if it works. So the return value from this function example, adding 1 and 2, should expect the return value of 3. So we're testing, right, the call versus the return we expect to be, which should be 3. So if this works out and this is true, this whole statement is true, then the test will pass and we'll get that feedback in our console. If it fails, if the test fails, then we're going to get feedback in the console telling us that our test is failing, our function must not be working, right? So for the DNA complement test, we need to keep all of this, except for we need to change the arguments we pass to the assert equals. All right, so we're going to use our function instead of the example. So DNA complement. I call it because we want to use it. We should have parameters to this function, which includes the DNA string that we want to find the complement of. So maybe one example is ATGC, or maybe we'll just use all of the possible bases in one string. And then if we passed it in, we would expect back the string TACG. This might be one pass you write. Now it also lets you put additional information down here in the failure message, which you can put whatever you want down here and it'll display on the result. So maybe in this failure message, I'll just put something so I know it's my custom message and I can see where it shows up. So maybe I'll say, you can see me when you run a test and it fails. Right, so I'll save that. And now when I click Run Tests, it'll run that test. And if it passes, I'll get a green check mark telling me that I passed. Otherwise, I'll get a red failure message. So in this case, it shows up red, tells me 0 out of 1 tests pass, because if you look at my code, I have not even defined this function yet. And that's why right now it says name DNA complement is not defined. Right. Well, let's actually define it and see if it works, even if it did exist. We'll include a parameter, And then we're not going to write any code, so we'll just say pass. Even in that case, where now we've actually implemented it, we can run this and it still doesn't pass, right? It says assertion error. My custom message shows up here. So it says you can see me when you run the test and it fails. And then it tells me a little bit about why it failed. So the return value was not what I expected. It was none because I didn't have any return statements in my function. So it is failing. Now I need to go and implement that function such that it works. Right? So that's one out of the three you'll have to write.